When I speak Mandarin, I have an American accent. You can see on the screen here that there are four main tones of Mandarin, and I really can't distinguish between my second and third tones. This has posed a really large issue for me growing up because everyone in my family, aside from my parents and sister, cannot speak English. And so whenever we communicate with each other, we have to use Mandarin. And whenever I speak Mandarin, however, the rest of my family can only understand half the words that I say. And so we have this really large language barrier, and it has prevented us in some ways from having stronger and deeper connections with each other. And sometimes I think about why I have such a poor accent. And up until I was 3 or 4 years old, actually, I only spoke in Mandarin. I had a perfectly fine accent. My parents only spoke Mandarin to me. And for a little bit of time, actually, I thought that everything was in Mandarin. I thought Mandarin was the norm. But it wasn't until I started elementary school that I realized that this wasn't the case. So just a little bit more background about me. I grew up in a majority white area. I'm from Fairfield County, Connecticut, if any of you know or have heard of that area. And I was one of the only Asian kids at my elementary and middle school. And so growing up, my peers would often ask me why I looked the way I did. They would call me names, slurs, project stereotypes onto me. And it really took a toll on both my identity and my sense of belonging. And to add on to that, in all of the picture books that I read and all the TV shows that I watched, I never saw API protagonists in them. In fact, there really were only white characters. And while I was too young to verbalize it, I never really felt represented or like I truly belonged. And this led to me having a really strong desire to assimilate. I wanted to be as whitewashed as possible. And so I rejected my culture. I would throw out my lunch at school. If someone made a joke about me being Asian, I would laugh it off instead of speaking up for myself. And most importantly, I stopped speaking Mandarin. And this is sort of the root cause and the start of why I have such a poor accent now. And I ended up going to a much more diverse high school. There, I was able to learn to embrace my heritage. And I even was able to publish an op-ed about in my school's newspaper arguing to have Lunar New Year off because it's such an important holiday to many API communities. And while I am so proud of my heritage now, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had had picture books with API protagonists in them as a kid, and sort of what effect that would have had on both me and my non-Asian peers. And so my experience just growing up really led me to my research topic, which is about how picture books depict Asian Americans and what happens when you give a kid like me some accurate representation. And to start off, I just want to show this infographic. And it's essentially about the number of picture books published in 2018. And looking at the data, we see that 77% of picture books published that year had either a white protagonist or an animal protagonist. And so we can see clearly that there is an underrepresentation of people of color in protagonist roles in picture books. And we really need to elevate these types of books and increase the amount that we publish about them. And while this is such a large issue, my main research topic is actually on what happens when we have picture books with API protagonists and how exactly we are represented in them. And in order to effectively talk about this subject, I want to introduce two main terms that I'll be using throughout the rest of my presentation. And those terms are culturally specific and culturally neutral. A culturally specific book is a book that emphasizes specific cultural aspects about the protagonist in the story. So what this is saying is that there's a protagonist of color and the plot line is somehow centered around or heavily emphasizes the protagonist's culture or race and ethnicity. And on the other hand, a culturally neutral book is a book that has characters of color, but the plot is not related to their culture. So to provide some examples, I first want to talk about a book called Suki's Kimono. And it's about a Japanese American girl named Suki who really wants to wear a traditional Japanese kimono to school. And despite her peers making fun of her initially, she ends up winning them over by performing a traditional Japanese dance. And this is a great example of a culturally specific book because Japanese culture is an integral part of the plot. Another example of a culturally specific book would actually be a picture book that a group of classmates and I made for our power class, and it's called Daisy and the Dragon. And Daisy and the Dragon is about a young Chinese American girl named Daisy who, like me, is the only Asian kid in her elementary school right now. And she goes through this initial phase of cultural rejection, and she doesn't want to do anything that's related to being Chinese. She wants to be as assimilated as possible, but Lunar New Year is coming up, and Daisy's parents actually want her to wear a traditional Chinese dress called a qipao to school to celebrate. And Daisy refuses to do this. And so her parents make her a deal saying that if she goes to Chinatown to collect preparations for the new year, then she doesn't have to wear the qipao to school. And so Daisy agrees. But then on her journey, she actually learns a lot more about her culture and has a lot of cultural interactions. And so by the time she gets home, she ends up embracing her culture. She loves her heritage. She's very proud of her heritage. And so she ends up wearing the qipao to school anyway. These are both, so Suki's Kimono and Daisy and the Dragon are both considered culturally specific books. And then a culturally neutral book would be Ming and Her Poppy, which is about a young girl named Ming who goes on a walk with her grandfather. And the book sort of just details the experiences and the encounters they have on their trip. And this is a culturally neutral book because the plotline is not centered around them being Asian. It's not centered around their culture or race or anything like that. So the root of my research question really is sort of, we have culturally specific books, we have culturally neutral books. Which of these two types of books would be more effective in representing API children and educating non-API children? And to answer this question, we really need to dive deep into both of these categories and see what are the benefits and the drawbacks within each category. And so within culturally specific books, there are actually three subgenres, the first of which being a beautiful life book. And beautiful life books are books where there are specific cultural experiences that the protagonist will face, and the reader will often learn some facet about the protagonist's culture. And so both Suki's Kimono and Daisy and the Dragon would be considered beautiful life books. Some benefits of beautiful life books are that they provide representation to Asian children and give an outlet for us to be proud of our culture. And these types of books can also educate non-Asian children about how multicultural our society can be and just teach them a little bit about different Asian cultures. However, if the only API children's books that were produced were beautiful life books, then there would be this narrative that culture is the only aspect of the API community that is worth being told as a story. And non-Asian children might also develop the assumption that Asians are other or un-American, which can further ostracize API children at school. The second type of culturally specific book is a folklore book. And a folklore book is essentially a book that is based on mythological stories from a specific culture. And an example of this would be The Lost Horse by Ed Young. Feel free to look at this book and give it a read after my presentation. But some good benefits of folklore books are that they're a great way to sort of preserve culture, as well as just teach younger generations about their culture and their heritage. So for Asian American children, it's a really great way for them to connect to their heritage and traditions. But for non-Asian children, it's also a great way to sort of learn about traditions that are unique to cultures that are different from theirs. However, if we only had folklore books produced about the API community, then that idea and sentiment that Asian Americans are other or foreign or exotic would just intensify even more. The last type of culturally specific book is an oppression book. And oppression books are stories that involve some sort of discrimination based on the protagonist's race and or culture. And an example of this would be Fish for Jimmy by Katie Yamasaki. Some benefits about oppression books are that they really make children aware of the different struggles that different racial groups can experience. And so they can really serve as a powerful tool for education in this sense. And for the API community specifically, these types of books can help combat the model minority myth. How some scholars will argue that oppression books only have positive effects, but if we only had oppression books written about API characters, then we would have the idea and the narrative that the API community is just solely composed of suffering and struggle. And while we do go through issues such as immigration issues, language barriers, everyday discrimination in a Western country, we are still so much more than the struggles we face, and the picture books written about us should represent this. Moving on to culturally neutral books, the first type is called an every child book. And an every child book is essentially where the character is a person of color, but the plot line is not related to their culture at all. So a good way to tell if we have an every child book or not is if the protagonist could be swapped out with a character of a different race and the book would still make sense. So an example of this would be Ming and Her Poppy. Some benefits of Every Child books are that they really help demonstrate that Asian Americans can belong in the American mainstream and that we aren't exotic or other. And this really helps, this message is conveyed to both API children and non-API children. So that message is hopefully coming across to children of all different backgrounds. However, if we only had Every Child books, then we would lose the cultural insight that culturally specific books can bring to the table. We wouldn't learn as much about different cultures. And for API children specifically, we would lose that cultural representation. The second type of culturally neutral book is a cross-group book. And these books do not have a main protagonist, but rather have children of different races or ethnicities interacting with each other. And an example of this would be The Other Side by Jacqueline Woodson. And so some benefits of cross-group books are that they really help promote positive relationships between people of different races and ethnicities, and they really help normalize diversity at such a young age. However, if we only had cross-group books, then we would once again lose the cultural insight that culturally specific books bring, and we wouldn't learn as much about different Asian cultures. The last type of culturally neutral book is an incidental book, and these are books where there's a white protagonist and non-white secondary characters. And an example of this would be Bully by Patricia Polacco. And while incidental books do have diversity and they do help promote the idea that our world is multicultural and our society is multicultural, at the same time, they are essentially just a weaker version of cross-group books. We don't have an API protagonist, and the idea that minorities are secondary to a white protagonist is not a mentality that we should be conveying to our children. So what does this all mean? So clearly, all of the genres that I talked about today have some sort of benefit to both API children and non-API children. But having one genre dominate the narrative can be really detrimental to a kid's perception of the API community. And since we really need to have books from all of these types of genres to be published so that kids can receive representation and receive sort of these connotations of the API community that make API kids feel welcomed without having to compromise their culture, and then teach non-API children that API kids can be American without having to sacrifice their traditions and their heritage. And so in order to accurately capture the hybridity of the Asian American experience, we really need to put some emphasis on both culture as well as narratives that do not focus on the protagonist's heritage or race. So thus, there needs to be a balance between culturally neutral books and culturally specific books circulated throughout our society. So where do we go from here? We now really need to look at the numbers and the current statistics on picture books with API protagonists so we can figure out how to sort of balance out everything and have a good ratio amongst the genres. And a 2018 study conducted by the Eastern Sociological Society actually does just that. In their study, they found 283 API characters in the books they sampled, and 219 of them were found in culturally specific books, while the other 64 of them were found in culturally neutral books. So we can see that we have nearly 3.5 times more culturally specific characters than culturally neutral characters. So there's an overwhelmingly large amount of culturally specific books. If we break it down by subgenre, we see that beautiful life books and folklore books actually predominate over the other subgenres. And so there really is an oversaturation of these two types of stories, and there needs to be a balance with them and the other API narratives. But that's not to say that we need to reduce the number of beautiful life books and folklore books. In fact, I would argue that we actually have the correct amount of them. We currently have a good amount of beautiful life and folklore books, and we really just need to raise the frequency of the other books and the other genres. And this is just to say that the amount of API picture books published should not have to be a zero-sum game. There's already such a low amount of them, and we shouldn't have to compromise one subgenre to boost the other. And so the solution really is to just maybe like keep the amount of books published per year about beautiful life and folklores the same and constant, while drastically increasing the amount of the other narratives that are being published about the API community. And so, for instance, Daisy and the Dragon is a beautiful life story, and that is totally fine, and it's such a good thing. We just need to make sure we have culturally neutral books that can also supplement Daisy and the Dragon. So we really need to increase these three categories: oppression, every child, and cross-group. And while there are so many more culturally specific books and culturally neutral books, I still included oppression in this category just because there are so few books published in this category, and they really do help combat the model minority myth that is so heavily placed on the API community. Every child books and cross group books need to be increased because we do need those culturally neutral books to sort of reinforce the idea that Asian Americans belong in the American mainstream. And these books really would help supplement the Beautiful Life books and the folklore books that provide that cultural representation for children. Lastly, while incidental books do have some diversity, when considering specifically API representation, I don't think we should count incidental books simply because they still have a white protagonist at the end of the day, and we really are looking to have more stories that feature Asian American main characters. So just to recap everything that I've talked about, there really needs to be a balance between culturally specific books and culturally neutral books with API protagonists. Representation is so crucial for a young child's development and education, and we really need to ensure that Asian American children receive accurate and holistic representation from the picture books they read, rather than just one narrative, or even worse, no narrative at all. So hopefully, with culturally specific and culturally neutral books, non-API kids will understand that API children can be part of the American norm while also having a culture that's different from theirs. And API children will hopefully feel comfortable enough in public and have a strong enough sense of belonging that they can outwardly engage with their culture. So I want to end my presentation by talking about an experience I had reading Daisy and the Dragon to a group of first graders this past quarter. So there are a lot of Chinese words integrated throughout Daisy and the Dragon, and we actually included a glossary and pronunciation guide for the kids in the back. It's on the screen here. And while I was reading the story aloud, there's a little Chinese American boy in the class who, after any time I said a Chinese word, he would repeat after me. And then after I finished reading the book, he said, "Did you know I'm Chinese? I can speak Chinese too. It's so cool." And then he proceeded to say, 这本书太棒了, which translates to, "This book is so good." And while the little boy probably didn't know this, hearing him talk so enthusiastically about his culture and his heritage really warmed my heart, because I wanted to make Daisy and the Dragon to provide a culturally specific book that made API children feel represented, and then made non-API children, help teach non-API children about a culture that was different from theirs. And so I really hope that this little boy and the rest of his class get to read more of these culturally specific books about API protagonists, but also are introduced to culturally neutral books as well that feature API protagonists, so that they sort of get this mix of these books, and hopefully it fosters an environment where API children feel like they belong, they feel comfortable, and they can also feel like they can engage with their culture without being ostracized. And so at the end of the day, I really hope that this little boy gets to continue embracing his culture. I hope that he gets to celebrate Lunar New Year. I hope he gets to introduce his friends and peers to Chinese culture. And I really, really hope that when he speaks Mandarin, he can speak it with a perfect accent. Thank you so much.